Jackie Coogan didn't have parents, he had pimps. They sold his childhood, frame by frame, for a fortune equivalent to over $60 million today. To get a reaction on camera, his father didn't act. He terrorized a 4-year-old by threatening to murder his puppy. They worked him until he collapsed, starved him of affection, and when he was finally an adult, his mother looked him in the eye in a courtroom and essentially said, "The child is an animal. We own the milk." They didn't just ruin his life, they eviscerated it. The exploitation of Jackie Coogan was not an accident. It was an industrial process. He was born into the hard, transient world of vaudeville on October 26, 1914. His father, Jack Coogan Sr., was a song and dance man who lived out of a suitcase, chasing applause in second-rate theaters across the American West. His mother, Lillian, was a former child performer herself, a woman who had tasted the spotlight early and knew the bitterness of fading away. There was no nursery for Jackie. His crib was a bureau drawer in a dressing room that smelled of grease paint, stale beer, and cheap tobacco. He did not learn to walk in a park. He learned to walk on stage. He did not learn to talk to make friends. He learned to talk to deliver a punchline. Jack Sr. realized early on that his son was a mimic of frightening precision. The toddler could watch a drunk stumble out of a saloon and replicate the gait perfectly. He could mirror the facial expressions of a weeping widow or a pompous politician. This was not just a parlor trick. In the cutthroat economy of 1920s, entertainment, it was a marketable asset. Jack Sr. brought the boy onto the stage of the Orpheum Theater in Los Angeles, not to play, but to work. He taught the toddler the shimmy, a suggestive dance usually performed by flappers in speakeasies. The sight of an innocent child performing the hip-shaking movements of a burlesque dancer was electric. The audience roared. They threw money. And sitting in that audience was Charlie Chaplin. Chaplin was looking for a prop. He needed a child to humanize his little tramp character, a foil to make the comedy land harder. He saw Jackie on stage and saw a mirror. He didn't just see a cute kid, he saw a professional. The contract was signed immediately. But this was not a fairy tale discovery. It was an acquisition. Chaplin essentially leased the boy from his father. The production of the film, The Kid, began, and with it, the systematic dismantling of Jackie's childhood. On the set, the lines between parenting and directing blurred into abuse. The most famous scene in The Kid features authorities tearing the crying boy away from the tramp. It is a moment of raw, guttural heartbreak that cemented Jackie's status as a global icon. But those tears were not acting. They were the result of psychological torture. When Jackie, a happy child surrounded by new toys, couldn't summon the hysteria Chaplin needed, Jack Sr. took his son aside. He didn't hit him. He leaned in close and told the 4-year-old that if he didn't cry immediately, they were going to take his beloved dog to the pound and have it killed. Jackie believed him. The terror in his eyes on screen is real. He was screaming for the life of his pet. When the director yelled, "Cut," the scene was in the can. The dog was safe. And Jackie had learned the most dangerous lesson of his life. His pain was currency. The release of The Kid in 1921 triggered a mania that the modern world would struggle to comprehend. Jackie Coogan was not just a star. He was the most famous person on earth under the height of 5 feet. He was knighted by the Pope. He was greeted by mayors and presidents. But the machinery behind him was cold and calculating. Jack Sr. quit his own career to manage the Kugan enterprise. He negotiated contracts that paid the boy $500,000 per picture, a sum that dwarfed the earnings of the President of the United States. But the salary was just the tip of the iceberg. The Coogans invented the modern celebrity merchandising machine. They licensed Jackie's face on everything. There were Coogan dolls, Coogan whistles, Coogan stationery, Coogan peanut butter, and Coogan caps. If a product could be sold to a mother or a child, it bore Jackie's likeness. He was a human logo. He spent his days off from filming doing photo shoots, shaking hands with department store tycoons, and signing autographs until his hand cramped. He was the engine of a multi-million-dollar conglomerate, yet he had no concept of the wealth he was generating. The money flowed into the Coogan household like a tidal wave, and it fundamentally altered the family dynamic. Jack Sr. and Lillian moved from cheap hotels to a palatial mansion in the most exclusive district of Los Angeles. They bought a fleet of Rolls-Royces. They hired a staff of servants. Jack Sr. adopted the affectations of an aristocrat. Wearing tailored suits and smoking expensive cigars, Lillian draped herself in furs and diamonds, transforming from a vaudeville hustler into the queen of Hollywood society. They justified the spending as maintenance. They claimed they needed the mansion to entertain studio heads. They needed the cars to maintain the image of the star. They needed the jewels to look the part at premieres. In reality, they were spending the principal. They were burning through the boy's earnings as fast as he could make them. To keep Jackie compliant, they instituted a system of financial control that bordered on the absurd. The boy who earned millions was given a weekly allowance of roughly $6. If he wanted a toy, a book, or a record, he had to petition his parents. He had to beg for the crumbs of his own fortune. Lillian Coogan viewed this arrangement not as theft, but as her divine right. She subscribed to the antiquated legal doctrine that a child is the chattel of the parent. In her mind, Jackie did not earn the money. She earned it by giving birth to him and managing his cuteness. She was the architect. He was the brick. When he worked a 12-hour day on set, she saw it as her labor, not his. She controlled his diet, his sleep, and his social interactions to ensure the asset remained productive. As the 1920s roared on, Jackie's life became a blur of work. He starred in Oliver Twist, Long Live the King, and Little Robinson Crusoe. He carried entire productions on his small shoulders. But biology is the enemy of the child star. By 1927, the round cheeks began to thin. The toddler's waddle was replaced by the awkward gait of a preteen. The voice began to crack. The cute factor, the very foundation of the Kugan empire, began to erode. The public's interest waned. They wanted the baby from the kid, not the young man standing before them. The box office receipts dipped. This terrified Jack Sr. and Lillian. Their lifestyle required a constant, massive influx of cash. They could not downsize. They could not sell the Rolls-Royces. They were addicted to the wealth, so they pushed the asset harder. When the movie offers slowed down, they sent Jackie back to the stage. They embarked on grueling vaudeville tours across America and Europe. The teenage Jackie was forced to reenact scenes from his childhood, performing the shimmy and reciting lines written for a 5-year-old. It was a humiliation. He was a museum exhibit of his own past, paraded in front of audiences who came to see a ghost. He worked through fevers. He worked through exhaustion. He worked because he loved his father and believed the lie that this was all for his future. Jack Sr. constantly assured his son that the money was safe. "It's all in trust, Jackie," he would say. "When you're 21, you'll be the richest man in Hollywood." Jackie believed him. He had no reason to doubt. He saw the house, the cars, the servants. He assumed the vault was full. He didn't see the ledgers. He didn't see the gambling debts. He didn't see the jewelry receipts that totaled more than his entire salary for a year. He was a prisoner in a gilded cage, the poorest millionaire in history, working to fund the very people who were robbing him blind. By the end of the silent era, the Coogan family was sitting on a powder keg. The industry was changing with the arrival of sound. The star was aging, and the spending had not slowed down. They were running a race against time, trying to extract the last drops of value from Jackie before he became an adult and legally a free agent. They needed to keep him under control, keep him ignorant, and keep him working until the very last second. That storm did not arrive with thunder, but with the slow creeping silence of a telephone that stopped ringing. The machinery of the Kugan empire, built entirely on the fragile foundation of a toddler's smile, was about to face an enemy it could not bribe, negotiate with, or charm: biology. The golden age was ending, and the era of the desperate hustle had begun. This desperation fueled the infamous European tour, often romanticized in biographies. In reality, it was a ruthless cash grab designed to keep the Kugan economy afloat. Jack Sr. booked a relentless schedule across the Atlantic: London, Paris, Rome, and Berlin. Crowds still gathered, but the nature of the fame had curdled. They came not to see the young man Jackie was becoming, but to touch the ghost of the child he used to be. Jackie, now an adolescent with a keen understanding of his own reality, felt the humiliation acutely. He was paraded before kings and queens, forced to smile and recount stories of filming The Kid, a movie he had made when he was 4 years old. He was a living museum exhibit. In London, he performed at the Palladium, earning $20,000 a week. It was a staggering sum, enough to keep the Kugan economy afloat for months. But the work was physically punishing. They did 4 shows a day. Between shows, Jack Sr. would march his son to interviews, charity events, and photo opportunities. There was no rest. There was no adolescence. There was only the Kugan act. During these travels, the financial malfeasance of the parents shifted from passive spending to active mismanagement. Jack Sr. was not just buying furs for Lillian anymore. He was gambling. He developed a taste for high-stakes poker and horse racing. He fancied himself a shrewd investor, pouring money into dubious real estate deals, oil wells that never pumped, and automotive ventures that collapsed. He bought a large ranch in San Diego County, a sprawling property that became a money pit. He justified every purchase as diversification for Jackie's trust. In truth, he was playing roulette with his son's labor. Lillian Kugan retreated into a cocoon of narcissism. To her, Jackie's declining career wasn't a natural progression of age. It was his personal failure. She grew colder. She criticized his posture, his hair, his weight. She blamed him for the dipping box office receipts. In her twisted logic, if Jackie worked harder, if he tried to be cuter, the money would return. She refused to cut back on her own spending. The Depression had hit America in 1929, devastating the economy. But inside the Kugan mansion, the party raged on. They were insulated by the pile of cash Jackie had earned, and they were burning through it with the desperation of people who knew the end was coming. Unlike Lillian, who viewed her son as a possession, Jack Sr. genuinely loved the boy. They were best friends. They hunted together, fished together, and navigated the treacherous waters of fame together. Jack Sr. was the only person who understood the pressure. Jackie was under because he was the one applying it. This bond made the exploitation invisible to Jackie. He didn't see a thief, he saw a partner. He saw a dad who was stressed, who was trying to keep the family safe, who was working just as hard as he was. When Jackie turned 18 in 1932, the legal landscape of his life remained unchanged. Under California law, he was still a minor until 21. The money was still entirely under his father's control. Jack Sr. continued to assure him that the trust fund was growing. He spoke of it with a solemn reverence. "You'll never have to work a day in your life after you turn 21, Jackie," he would say, clapping his son on the back. "I've taken care of everything. Jackie believed him. Why wouldn't he? This was the man who had protected him from the studio bosses, who had managed his contracts, who had been his shield against the world. The idea that his father was systematically looting his future was a thought too painful to entertain. In 1932, Jackie enrolled at Santa Clara University. It was a brief attempt at normalcy. For the first time, he was away from the suffocating atmosphere of the mansion and the relentless schedule of the stage. He tried to be just another student. He joined a fraternity. He went to football games. He tried to date girls who didn't know his IMDb page, but he was marked. He was the kid. He couldn't walk across campus without being pointed at. And he was broke. The Millionaire Boy was the poorest student on campus. His allowance had barely increased. While his classmates, sons of doctors and lawyers, had spending money for cars and dates, Jackie had to write letters home, begging for cash to buy textbooks. Jack Sr. would send small checks, often accompanied by lectures on frugality. "We have to be careful, Jackie," he would write. "The market is down. We're holding tight for your birthday." The gaslighting was absolute. Jackie sat in his dorm room reading newspapers that estimated his wealth at $4 million, while he couldn't afford a new pair of shoes. He began to feel the first stirrings of doubt. He saw the disconnect between the public perception of his wealth and his private reality. But he pushed the doubt down. To question the money was to question his father's love, and that was a bridge he could not cross. By 1934, the academic experiment had failed. Jackie's grades suffered under the distraction of his fame and the constant pull of his parents to return to work. He dropped out of Santa Clara. He was 20 years old, drifting, unsure of his place in a world that only valued him as a memory. Jack Sr. had a new plan. If the movies didn't want Jackie and vaudeville was dying, they would pivot to business. They would develop the ranch in San Diego. They would turn it into a resort, a hunting lodge for the Hollywood elite. It was another gamble, another way to use Jackie's name to leverage credit and loans. It was a Saturday. Jackie, his father, and two of Jackie's closest friends, Junior Durkin, a fellow child actor who had played Huckleberry Finn, and Robert Horner, a young rancher, decided to drive down to the ranch in San Diego for a day of dove hunting. It was meant to be a boys' trip, a moment of escape from the pressures of Hollywood and the suffocating presence of Lillian. They took the new car. It was a powerful vehicle, a symbol of the Kugan status. Jack Sr. was driving. Jackie was in the passenger seat. Durkin and Horner were in the back. They spent the day at the ranch, drinking a little, shooting clay pigeons, laughing. For a few hours, they were just men, unburdened by the machinery of fame. As evening fell, they began the drive back to Los Angeles. They took the Ridge Route, a notorious stretch of highway known for its treacherous curves and steep drop-offs. It was dark. The road was narrow and unlit. Jack Sr. was a confident driver, perhaps too confident. He was speeding, pushing the heavy car through the winding mountain passes. Jackie dozed in the passenger seat, lulled by the hum of the engine and the warmth of the alcohol they had consumed earlier. Around 6 p.m., near Pine Valley, a car appeared in the opposite lane. It was drifting, erratic. Jack Sr. swerved to avoid a collision. The Coogan car left the pavement. Cars in the 1930s were traps of rigid steel, no seatbelts, no airbags. When they crashed, the metal didn't crumple. It transferred every ounce of force directly into the bone and flesh of the passengers. The vehicle careened off the road, flipped, and rolled down a rocky embankment, tumbling over and over like a tossed toy in a canyon. The sound of tearing metal and shattering glass pierced the silence of the mountains. When the car finally came to a rest at the bottom of the ravine, the silence returned, heavier than before. Jack Coogan Sr. was dead. The impact had thrown him against the steering column, crushing his chest. The man who had built the empire, the man who had signed the contracts, the man who had spent the millions, was gone in a heartbeat. Junior Durkin was dead. He had been thrown from the vehicle and suffered massive head trauma. He was 19 years old. Robert Horner was dead. The only survivor was Jackie. He was found hours later, pulled from the wreckage by passing motorists who had seen the skid marks. He was battered, bloody, and in shock. He had broken ribs, a concussion, and severe bruising. But he was alive. He was the sole witness to the destruction of his world. The ambulance ride to the hospital in San Diego was a blur of pain and confusion. Jackie drifted in and out of consciousness. He asked for his father. He asked for Junior. The paramedics, knowing the truth, said nothing. When he woke up in the hospital bed, the reality was delivered to him by a doctor. His father was dead. His best friend was dead. The physical pain was agonizing, but the psychological blow was cataclysmic. In a single instant, Jackie had lost his entire support system. Jack Sr. had been the buffer. He had been the filter between Jackie and Lillian. He had been the manager, the banker, and the friend. Without him, Jackie was exposed. Lillian arrived at the hospital the next day. She was dressed in black, playing the role of the grieving widow for the press photographers gathered in the lobby. But in the hospital room, the dynamic shifted immediately. She did not hold her son. She did not weep for the loss of the boy's father. Her concern was the car. Her concern was the insurance. Her concern was the ranch. She looked at her son, lying broken in a hospital bed, and she saw a liability. With Jack Sr. gone, the business was in jeopardy. There was no one to manage the deals. There was no one to keep the creditors at bay. And then the realization hit her. Jack Sr. died intestate. He left no will. Under California law, this created a complex legal situation regarding the estate. But Lillian knew something Jackie didn't. She knew the accounts were empty. She knew the debts were piling up. And she knew that now, as the sole guardian of the minor Jackie Coogan, she had total unchecked control over whatever scraps remained. For Jackie, the grief was a heavy, suffocating blanket. He returned to the empty mansion on Oxford Street to recover. The house felt massive and cold. The silence was deafening. He wandered the halls, looking at the portraits of himself as a child, looking at the photos of his father. He waited for his mother to comfort him. He waited for them to mourn together. But Lillian was busy. She was meeting with lawyers. She was meeting with Arthur Bernstein. Bernstein had been the family's business manager and lawyer for years. He was a slick, oily man with a sharp mind for contracts and a total lack of moral compass. He had been Jack Sr.'s enabler, helping him set up the shell companies and the bad investments. Now, with Jack Sr. out of the way, Bernstein saw an opportunity. He didn't just comfort the widow. He seduced her. Within months of the crash, Lillian and Arthur Bernstein were inseparable. They moved quickly to consolidate their power. They fired the few servants who were loyal to Jackie. They changed the locks on the safes. They began to treat Jackie not as the master of the house, but as a tenant who was overstaying his welcome. Jackie, still recovering from his injuries and blinded by grief, didn't see the coup happening. He trusted Bernstein because his father had trusted him. He assumed Bernstein was helping them navigate the legal mess of the estate. He didn't know that Bernstein was advising Lillian on exactly how to cut her son out of his own fortune. He didn't know that they were restructuring the assets to ensure that when Jackie turned 21 in October, he would inherit absolutely nothing. The crash had killed his father, but the aftermath was killing his future. The car accident was a violent, sudden trauma. What followed was a slow, methodical, surgical removal of his rights. The vultures were not circling the carcass of the car in the ravine. They were sitting at his dinner table, drinking his wine and planning his demise. As the summer of 1935 dragged on, Jackie began to heal physically, but the atmosphere in the house grew toxic. Lillian stopped giving him his allowance. She told him money was tight because of the legal issues with his father's death. She told him they might lose the house. She told him he needed to go out and find work, any work, to help the family survive. Jackie, feeling a sense of duty, tried. He looked for acting roles, but the industry knew he was damaged goods. A washed-up child star with a dead father and a litigious mother was not a hot commodity. He was isolated. He was grieving, and he was broke. The stage was set for the final betrayal. The 21st birthday was approaching. It was the date Jackie had been promised his entire life. The date the trust fund would unlock. The date he would become the millionaire he had always been on paper. He had no idea that the vault was empty. He had no idea that his mother and his new stepfather-to-be were preparing a legal argument that would shock the nation. He was walking toward a cliff edge, thinking it was a finish line. The crash had taken his past. The lawyers were coming for his future. While Jackie lay in a hospital bed, sedated and broken, the legal machinery that would strip him bare was already being oiled. There would be no grace period for his grief. The mourning period was short. The looting period was immediate. The father was dead, but the predators were very much alive and preparing to take their seats in the front row. The funeral of Jack Coogan Sr. in May 1935 was a spectacle of Hollywood grief. The industry turned out in force. Flowers piled high on the grave, weeping fans lined the cemetery gates, and eulogies painted a portrait of a devoted father and a brilliant manager. Standing at the center of this tableau was Jackie Coogan, 20 years old, his ribs still taped from the crash, his face a mask of physical and emotional agony. Beside him stood Lillian Kugan, the grieving widow veiled in black lace. But even as the dirt was being shoveled onto the casket, the dynamic had shifted. The buffer was gone. Jack Sr. had been a gambler and a spender, but he had viewed the fortune as a family resource. Lillian viewed it as her personal dowry, and she was no longer operating alone. Enter Arthur Bernstein. Bernstein was the family's business manager and lawyer. He was a man of the system, slick, articulate, and devoid of the sentimental attachment that had occasionally stayed Jack Sr.'s hand. He saw the Kugan estate not as a legacy for a grieving son, but as a distressed asset ripe for a hostile takeover. His courtship of the widow was swift and strategic. In the months following the crash, the atmosphere inside the mansion on Oxford Street curdled. The shared grief did not bring mother and son together. It drove a wedge between them. Lillian, emboldened by Bernstein's counsel, stopped pretending. The pretense of saving for Jackie was dropped. The narrative changed. Now, the money was ours. Jackie, still recovering from the trauma of the accident that killed his father and best friend, was in a state of psychological paralysis. He was living in a fog. He trusted his mother because he had no one else. He assumed that when the dust settled, they would sit down and discuss the estate. He assumed that the millions his father had spoken of, the bonds, the investments, the cash reserves, were waiting for him. He was wrong. Bernstein moved into the mansion. He took over Jack Sr.'s office. He took over the ledgers. He began to restructure the holdings. Shell companies were dissolved. Assets were transferred. The paper trail of the Kugan fortune, already murky due to Jack Sr.'s gambling, was being actively erased. On October 26, 1935, Jackie Kugan turned 21. This was the date that had been whispered about for nearly 2 decades. It was the finish line. The press ran articles speculating on the millionaire kid coming into his inheritance. The public expected a coronation. They imagined Jackie signing papers and walking out of a bank with a check for $4 million. The reality was a non-event. There was no party. There was no meeting with bankers. There was no handing over of the keys to the kingdom. When Jackie asked about the trust, Lillian and Bernstein told him it was complicated. They said the estate was in probate. They said Jack Sr. had left a mess of debts that needed to be cleared. They said the market was down, and liquidating assets now would be foolish. "We're protecting you," Jackie Bernstein told him. "You're not ready to handle this kind of responsibility. Let us clear up the legalities." It was a lie, but it was a plausible one. Probate is slow. Legal matters are complex. Jackie, who had never written a check in his life and had no understanding of finance, accepted it. He accepted the continued allowance of $6 a week. He accepted living in his childhood bedroom while his mother and her new lover occupied the master suite. He was 21, a legal adult, a world-famous celebrity, and he had to ask his stepfather for gas money. The humiliation was grinding. To the outside world, he was rich. He would go to nightclubs and be handed the bill, the waiters expecting a lavish tip from the Millionaire Boy. He would have to fumble, make excuses, or sign a tab that he prayed his mother would pay. He was living a double life, a prince in public, a pauper in private. But the stasis couldn't last. The catalyst for the explosion arrived in the form of a blonde bombshell. In 1937, at a party in Hollywood, Jackie met Betty Grable. Betty was everything Jackie was not: rising, hungry, and untouched by the tragedy of early fame. She was a chorus girl on the verge of superstardom, possessed of a radiant energy and the famous million-dollar legs. They fell in love hard and fast. For Jackie, Betty was a lifeline. She was the first person in years who looked at him and saw a man, not a washed-up child star. She gave him confidence. She gave him a reason to fight. But love in Hollywood requires capital. Jackie wanted to marry Betty. He wanted to buy her a ring. He wanted to buy a house. He wanted to start a life. He went to his mother. The conversation that took place in the drawing room of the Oxford Street mansion in late 1937 is one of the most pivotal moments in the history of entertainment law. It was the moment the mask slipped. Jackie stood before Lillian and Arthur Bernstein. He explained that he was going to propose to Betty. He explained that he needed access to his money, not all of it, just enough to get started. He asked for a distribution from the trust. Lillian Kugan was sitting on a velvet sofa smoking a cigarette. She didn't look up. She flicked an ash and delivered the sentence that would shatter her son's reality. "You haven't got a cent?" she said. "There is nothing?" Jackie laughed. He thought it was a joke, a cruel, tasteless joke, but a joke nonetheless. "Come on, Mom," he said. "Dad always said." "Your father was a fool," she snapped. "There is no trust. There is no money for you. It's gone." Jackie turned to Bernstein. Surely the lawyer, the man of reason, would correct this. Bernstein stood up. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered a legal lecture. He explained with the cold precision of a reptile the facts of life under California common law. "You don't understand, Jackie," Bernstein said. "The law is clear. A child's earnings belong to the parents. Every dime you made before you were 21 was ours. We didn't save it for you because we didn't have to. It was never yours to begin with." He went further. He explained that the money had been spent on his maintenance. The house, the food, the clothes, the travel. It all cost money, Bernstein argued. They had spent the fortune raising the fortune maker. "You're a nice boy, Jackie," Bernstein said, dismissing him. "But you're a has-been. You're lucky we let you live here." The shock was physical. Jackie stumbled out of the room. He felt as if he had been in another car crash. The betrayal was total. It wasn't just greed. It was a fundamental denial of his existence. They were telling him that his labor, his childhood, his tears, his talent, it all belonged to them. He was not a person. He was a crop they had harvested and sold. He went to Betty. He told her the truth. He was broke. He had nothing to offer her but his name and his debt. Betty Grable proved to be made of sterner stuff than the Coogans expected. She didn't leave him. She was furious on his behalf. She told him he had to fight. She told him he had to sue. This was a radical idea. In 1938, suing one's mother was social suicide. It was considered grotesque, ungrateful, and scandalous. The press would tear him apart. The industry would blacklist him. But Jackie had reached the breaking point. The cognitive dissonance was too great. He could no longer reconcile the memory of his father's promises with the reality of his stepfather's sneer. He realized that if he didn't fight, he would spend the rest of his life as a pet in his mother's house, begging for scraps. He hired a lawyer. The filing of the lawsuit Coogan versus Kugan in April 1938 sent shockwaves through America. It was the lead story in every newspaper from New York to San Francisco. The headline, "The Kid Sues His Mother," was a punch to the gut of the national consciousness. The public was confused. How could the richest boy in the world be broke? How could the mother of America's sweetheart be a thief? Lillian and Bernstein hit back immediately. They launched a PR offensive designed to destroy Jackie's reputation. They painted him as an ungrateful, spoiled brat who had blown his allowance on partying. They claimed he was being manipulated by Betty Grable, whom they characterized as a gold digger. Bernstein gave interviews where he laid out the Roman law defense. He stated publicly, "The law is on our side. A parent has the right to the services and earnings of a minor child." He wasn't hiding the theft. He was normalizing it. He was challenging the world to find a statute that said he was wrong. Inside the courtroom, the gloves came off. The pretrial depositions were brutal. Bernstein and Lillian were forced to open the books, or what was left of them. The financial forensics revealed a horror story of spending. The record showed that while Jackie was working 6-day weeks on set, Lillian was spending $1,000 a month on furs. It showed gambling debts of Jack Sr. in the tens of thousands. It showed investments in diamond mines that didn't exist. It showed that the trust Jack Sr. had spoken of was a fiction. There was no segregated account. There was just one big pot, and the Coogans had been dipping into it for 15 years. But the emotional violence was worse than the financial accounting. Lillian Coogan took the stand during the depositions. She was asked, under oath, if she had ever promised to save money for Jackie. Her answer became infamous. "No promises were ever made to give Jackie anything," she said, her face hard as stone. "Every dollar a kid earns before he is 21 belongs to his parents. He had a good life. He didn't want for anything. Why should he get the money now?" She looked at her son across the table and saw nothing but a failed investment. She disparaged his talent. She said he was washed up. She said he couldn't act his way out of a paper bag as an adult. She used his professional decline as a justification for her financial theft. "He's a nice boy," she said, "but he's no businessman. If we gave him the money, he'd just lose it." It was gaslighting on a grand scale. She was arguing that she had to steal his money to protect him from himself. For Jackie, sitting in that room, listening to his mother describe him as a worthless commodity, something broke. The last vestiges of the good boy programming from his Disney-like childhood dissolved. He realized that the woman across from him was not his mother in any meaningful sense. She was a parasite who had attached herself to him at birth and had finally sucked him dry. The public turned on Lillian. The sheer callousness of her testimony, the assertion that a child is property, offended the moral sensibilities of the Depression-era public. People were struggling to eat, yet here was a woman in diamonds arguing that she had the right to steal millions from her own son. But public opinion is not the law. Bernstein was a good lawyer, and he was right about the statutes. California law did favor the parents. There was no precedent for a child reclaiming earnings that had been spent during their minority. The judge was in a bind. The moral case was overwhelmingly for Jackie. The legal case was murky. As the trial loomed, the pressure on Jackie was immense. He was newly married to Betty Grable, but the honeymoon was overshadowed by legal bills and paparazzi. He was broke. He had to borrow money from friends to buy groceries. The millionaire kid was living hand to mouth, while his lawyers fought for a fortune that might already be gone. And then a new figure entered the fray: the state of California. Legislators in Sacramento were watching the case. They realized that the Coogan disaster exposed a massive hole in the state's labor laws. Hollywood was built on the backs of children: Shirley Temple, Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland. If Jackie Coogan could be robbed legally, then every child star was vulnerable. The lawsuit was no longer just about Jackie's money. It was about the legitimacy of the entire industry. If the public believed that child stardom was just a form of legalized slavery, they might stop buying tickets. The studios, terrified of regulation and bad press, began to quietly pressure Bernstein to settle. But Bernstein was arrogant. He believed he could win. He believed he could crush his stepson in court and walk away with whatever was left of the cash. He didn't realize that he had awakened a sleeping giant. The verdict was coming, but it wouldn't just decide the fate of the Coogan fortune. It would rewrite the rules of childhood in America. That rewriting began in a crowded room in downtown Los Angeles, where a mother and son faced each other not as family, but as combatants. The gloves were off, the papers were filed, and the private rot of the Coogan dynasty was about to be dragged into the cold, unforgiving light of the public square. The Hall of Records in downtown Los Angeles became the arena for the dissection of the American dream in April 1938. The proceedings of Coogan versus Coogan were not merely a contract dispute. They were a public autopsy of a family unit that had rotted from the inside out. On one side of the aisle sat Jackie Coogan, 23 years old, his face pale and drawn, wearing a suit that was likely one of the few he still owned. Beside him sat Betty Grable, his new wife, whose rising stardom stood in stark contrast to her husband's financial ruin. On the other side sat Lillian Coogan and Arthur Bernstein. They arrived in a chauffeured car. Lillian wore a silver fox fur coat and diamond earrings that caught the light of the flashbulbs, jewelry that everyone in the room knew had been purchased with the plaintiff's labor. The atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with a specific kind of Depression-era resentment. The public, standing in bread lines and struggling to find work, watched with morbid fascination as a mother argued that she had the right to starve her millionaire son. The legal strategy employed by Arthur Bernstein was not one of denial. He did not claim that the money was still there. He did not claim that Jackie had spent it. He chose a defense that was breathtaking in its arrogance and historical cruelty. Bernstein doubled down on the cruel logic he had used in private. He invoked the ancient doctrine of paterfamilias, arguing that a child actor was no different from a plow horse on a farm. In his view, the harvest, the $4 million, belonged entirely to the farmers, Jack and Lillian. He declared to the court without shame that the Coogans owed Jackie absolutely nothing. This argument stripped the veneer of family away from the case. The millions of feet of film, the thousands of hours of interviews, the grueling world tours, none of it counted as Jackie's work. It was simply his duty as a subordinate member of the household. Lillian Coogan took the stand to reinforce this dehumanization. Her testimony remains one of the most chilling displays of maternal indifference in legal history. Under direct examination, she was asked if she had ever promised to hold the money in trust for her son. She adjusted her furs, looked the judge in the eye, and delivered the line that would define the trial. No promises were ever made to give Jackie anything, she said. Her voice was steady. Every dollar a kid earns before he is 21 belongs to his parents. Jackie has had a wonderful life. He has never wanted for anything. He had the best clothes, the best food, the best education. That was his payment. She dismantled the myth of the Kugan trust in seconds. The accounts that Jack Sr. had bragged about to the press were fictions. There was no segregated fund. There was only the Kugan bank account, and Lillian and Bernstein had treated it as their personal piggy bank. She went further, attacking her son's character to justify the theft. She painted him as a has-been, a washed-up actor who couldn't handle money if he had it. She claimed that withholding the fortune was an act of tough love, a way to prevent him from squandering it on his new wife. The cruelty of this tactic was precise. Lillian knew that Jackie's self-worth was tied to his career. By attacking his talent in open court, she was trying to break him psychologically. She was telling the world that the boy they loved was gone, replaced by an incompetent man who needed his mother's control. The financial forensics presented by Jackie's legal team painted a different picture. As the accountants drilled into the ledgers, the scale of the looting became apparent. The maintenance that Lillian claimed had consumed the fortune was exposed as a litany of excess. The book showed expenditures of thousands of dollars a month on parties, liquor, gambling debts, and luxury cars. There were receipts for jewelry purchases that exceeded the annual salary of a bank president. There were real estate investments in speculative ventures that had vanished into thin air. The accountants traced the flow of money from the studios to the Kugan accounts, and then out again into the pockets of jewelers, furriers, and bookies. The burn rate was staggering. In the years following Jack Sr.'s death, Lillian and Bernstein had accelerated the spending, treating the principal as income. They were liquidating the estate as fast as they could, seemingly aware that a reckoning might come. The discrepancy between Jackie's allowance and his earnings was laid bare. The court heard testimony that while Jackie was generating $10,000 a week, during his peak he was receiving $6.25 for pocket money. He had to beg for money to buy a record player. He had to ask permission to buy a hamburger. The juxtaposition of the richest boy in the world being unable to pay for his own lunch humanized the legal abstraction. It wasn't just about the millions. It was about the daily humiliation of total financial dependence. Public sentiment turned violently against Lillian. She became a caricature of the evil stepmother, a woman who devoured her own young. Letters poured into the courthouse supporting Jackie. Editorials denounced the ancient laws that allowed such theft. The trial became a referendum on the rights of children in the entertainment industry. It asked a fundamental question: is a child actor an employee or is he a slave? But sentiment does not override statute. The judge was bound by the laws of California. While the moral case for Jackie was overwhelming, the legal precedent supported Bernstein. The defense team moved for a dismissal, arguing that since no written contract existed between Jackie and his parents regarding a trust, there was no violation. They argued that Jack Sr.'s verbal promises to the press were puffery, marketing tactics designed to make the family look good, not binding legal agreements. Jackie sat through the proceedings with a growing sense of horror. He realized that even if he won, he had already lost. The money wasn't hidden in a Swiss bank account. It wasn't buried in the backyard. It was gone. It was on his mother's fingers. It was in the garage. It was in the memories of parties he hadn't been invited to. The realization broke him. He wept in the courtroom, not for the money, but for the retroactive destruction of his childhood. He realized that every smile he had forced for the camera, every tear he had summoned for Chaplin, Every hand he had shaken on tour, it had all been for nothing. He had been a battery, drained of energy to power his mother's vanity. As the trial dragged into the summer of 1938, the pressure on Bernstein and Lillian increased. The negative publicity was damaging Bernstein's law practice and making them social pariahs in Hollywood. The studios, terrified that the scandal would lead to unions or government oversight of child labor, began to exert back-channel pressure on the couple to settle. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer did not want the public thinking that buying a movie ticket was supporting child abuse. The settlement negotiations were tense. Jackie's lawyers pushed for a full accounting. Bernstein fought to keep the remaining assets hidden. Finally, a deal was struck. The court ordered a division of the remaining estate. The final accounting was the ultimate punchline to the tragedy. The forensic accountants estimated that Jackie Coogan had earned approximately $4 million during his minority. When the debts were paid, the mortgages settled, and the maintenance costs deducted, the remaining estate was valued at roughly $250,000. Under the settlement, Jackie was entitled to half, $126,000. That was the sum total of his childhood. $4 million of labor had been distilled down to a check that wouldn't even cover the taxes on the mansion he had bought for them. After legal fees, Jackie walked away with even less. He was legally vindicated but financially gutted. The psychological toll on Jackie was immediate. He had won the lawsuit, but he had lost his mother. The relationship was severed. Lillian remained unrepentant to the end, maintaining that she had been the victim of an ungrateful son. She kept the furs. She kept the jewelry. She kept the narrative that she was a martyr. For Jackie, the money was gone, but the stigma remained. He was now known as the man who sued his mother. In the tight-knit, image-obsessed world of 1930s Hollywood, this was a stain. Producers saw him as litigious and difficult. The roles that had been scarce before the trial now vanished completely. He was radioactive. He tried to pivot. He invested his small settlement in a business venture, a flower shop, trying to find some stability outside the industry. But he had no experience in business. He had been raised to be a star, not a shopkeeper. The venture struggled. His marriage to Betty Grable suffered under the weight of the stress. Betty had been a stalwart supporter during the trial, but the reality of living with a broken, bitter man who was obsessed with the past took its toll. Jackie began to drink. He gained weight. The hair loss that had started in his late teens accelerated. He looked in the mirror and saw a stranger, a premature old man who bore no resemblance to the kid. By 1939, Jackie Kugan was divorced, broke, and unemployed. The golden boy was 24 years old and had lived a lifetime of tragedy. The world moved on. New child stars appeared. Shirley Temple was now the queen of the lot, earning millions that her parents, thankfully, were not stealing. The public forgot about the lawsuit. They forgot about the theft. But the legislature did not forget the outrage generated by Kugan versus. Kugan forced the California Assembly to act. In 1939, Governor Colbert Olson signed the California Child Actors Bill into law. It was a direct response to the testimony of Lillian Kugan. The law mandated that a judge must approve all contracts for child actors. It required that 15% of the child's gross earnings be set aside in a blocked trust, a Kugan account, that belonged solely to the child, untouchable by parents or managers. It also codified that the child's earnings were their separate property, not the property of the parents. It was a landmark victory for labor rights. It ensured that no child would ever again be legally robbed by their own family in the state of California. But laws are not retroactive. The Kugan Act saved Judy Garland from total ruin. It saved Elizabeth Taylor. It saved Ron Howard, but it could not save Jackie Coogan. He was the sacrifice. He was the canary in the coal mine who had to die so that the others could breathe. The irony was bitter. Jackie had changed the world, but the world had left him behind. He sat in his small apartment, reading about the new law that bore his name, knowing that he would never see a dime of the millions he had generated. He was a pauper who had endowed a generation of millionaires. As the 1940s approached, Jackie Coogan drifted. The war in Europe was heating up. The world was changing again. He looked for a way to escape the shadow of his own name. He joined the army. World War II offered Jackie something Hollywood never could: anonymity. In a uniform with a shaved head, he wasn't the kid. He was just another soldier. He served as a glider pilot in the Burma campaign, flying dangerous missions behind enemy lines. For the first time in his life, he was judged on his courage and skill, not his cuteness. He found a brotherhood among the pilots that replaced the family he had lost. But the war eventually ended. Jackie returned to Los Angeles in 1945, a war hero with medals on his chest but no job waiting for him. The industry had moved on completely. The silence of his phone was deafening. He took whatever work he could find. He sold appliances. He did small, degrading nightclub acts. He was a curiosity, a "where are they now" story walking down Hollywood Boulevard. The betrayal by his mother continued to haunt him. Lillian lived comfortably on the remnants of the fortune and the generosity of her new husband. She never apologized. She never offered restitution. She lived in a reality where she was the victim and her son was the villain. Jackie carried the scars of the theft in his body. His face, once the definition of cherubic beauty, hardened. His eyes, which Chaplin had loved for their expressiveness, grew dark and hooded. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had seen too much. And then in the strange alchemy of television, that brokenness became an asset. In the 1950s, the medium of television began to recycle old Hollywood. Jackie found work in character roles. He played heavies, criminals, sad sacks. He used his physical deterioration to his advantage. He stopped trying to be the leading man and embraced the grotesque. This path led him inevitably to a mansion of a different kind. Not the Oxford Street palace of his youth, but a spooky, cobweb-filled house on a soundstage. By 1964, Jackie Coogan was 50 years old. The angelic face of the kid had been eroded by time, war, and alcohol. He was heavy-set, prematurely bald, and carried the weary demeanor of a man who had lived 3 lifetimes before most men lived one. To the casting directors of Hollywood, he was a relic. He was a trivia answer. He was the has-been who sued his mother. He was broke. The settlement from the 1938 lawsuit had long since evaporated, consumed by bad business ventures and the cost of living. He was twice divorced, supporting children, and hustling for bit parts in television westerns like Gunsmoke and Perry Mason. He played bartenders, thugs, and background characters, roles that required a face that looked lived in. He was grateful for the work, but it was a humiliating descent for a man who had once been the highest-paid actor on Earth. Then came the call for the Addams Family. ABC was developing a sitcom based on the macabre cartoons of Charles Addams. They were looking for an ensemble cast to play a family of wealthy, eccentric monsters who lived in a decrepit mansion and delighted in the grotesque. The role of Uncle Fester, the bald, hunchbacked, electrically charged brother, was open. Jackie Coogan saw the character breakdown and recognized himself. Fester was a child trapped in a decaying body. He was innocent, but dangerous. He was an outcast who lived happily in his own delusions. He was a man who lit up light bulbs in his mouth, a parlor trick that required a special kind of desperate commitment. The audition process was competitive. Hollywood was full of aging character actors looking for a steady paycheck. Jackie knew he had to do something drastic. He went home, stood in front of the bathroom mirror, and shaved his head completely bald. He shaved his eyebrows. He put on a dark, heavy frock coat that smelled of mothballs. He transformed himself into a ghoul. When he walked into the casting office, the producers didn't see Jackie Coogan, the tragic child star. They saw Uncle Fester. He didn't just play the role, he inhabited it. He cackled, he hunched, he projected a manic, chaotic energy that was both terrifying and endearing. He got the part on the spot. The industry that had rejected him for growing up, for losing his hair, for losing his cuteness, was now paying him because he had lost those things. His physical deterioration, which had been his curse for 30 years, became his asset. The ugliness was the point. The Addams Family premiered in September 1964. It was an instant hit. Jackie Coogan was famous again, but it was a different kind of fame. A generation of children watched the show having no idea that the bald, cackling monster on screen was once the beautiful boy from The Kid. To them, he was just Uncle Fester. He was funny, he was weird, he was beloved. For Jackie, the role was a resurrection, but it was also a form of therapy. Uncle Fester allowed him to scream, to explode things, to be anarchic. Fester was a character who loved pain. He slept on a bed of nails. He put his head in a vice for fun. For a man who had been emotionally tortured by his own family, playing a masochist must have felt strangely familiar. He channeled his rage and his trauma into the character's manic joy. The show paid well, but it did not pay Kugan money. He earned a standard television salary. There were no millions to be made. The merchandising machine cranked up again. Fester dolls, Fester lunchboxes. But this time, Jackie had a better contract. He got his cut. It wasn't enough to replace the stolen fortune, but it was enough to buy dignity. It was enough to pay the rent. On set, Jackie was a professional. He was kind to the child actors on the show, Ken Weatherwax and Lisa Loring. He was protective of them. He knew better than anyone the dangers of the industry. He would tell stories about the old days, about Chaplin and the silent era, speaking of them like ancient history. He was the link between the two Hollywoods, the silent golden age of the 1920s and the cynical commercial age of 1960s television. However, the shadow of his mother never truly faded. Lillian Coogan was still alive during this period. She watched her son's comeback from a distance. The relationship remained fractured. There was no tearful reunion, no public apology. She held on to her narrative of victimhood until the bitter end. When she died, Jackie attended the funeral, but the distance between them was measured in more than just years. It was measured in dollars and betrayal. The Addams Family ended in 1966, marking the conclusion of his second life as a star. But for Jackie, wreckage could still serve a purpose. From the ruins of his stardom, Jackie Coogan began to build something more durable than fame. When the makeup came off and the studio lights dimmed for the last time, he moved into his final act not as a star, but as a protector. The final years of Jackie Coogan were lived in the quiet shadow of his own history. By the late 1970s, the mania of the Addams Family had subsided, and he had settled into the role of a Hollywood elder statesman, a survivor of a war that most people didn't know had been fought. He lived in Santa Monica, far from the Oxford Street mansion of his youth. His home was modest. His car was practical. The fleet of Rolls-Royces was a memory as distant and unreal as the silent movies flickering in the archives. He continued to work because he had to. There were guest spots on Hawaii Five-0, Macmillan and Wife, and The Brady Bunch. He played the roles assigned to aging character actors, the grumpy neighbor, the corrupt politician, the weary sheriff. He brought a professionalism to these parts that commanded respect on set. Directors knew that when they hired Jackie Coogan, they were hiring a man who had forgotten more about acting than the lead stars would ever know. But they also knew they were hiring a tragedy. Behind the scenes, Jackie became an unofficial counselor to a new generation of child stars. Parents of up-and-coming actors would seek him out, often quietly, asking for advice. They wanted to know how to navigate the contracts, the studios, and the press. Jackie's advice was always the same, delivered with the blunt force of experience. Trust no one, not the studio, not the agents, and especially not the family. He would tap the table and say, check the accounts. Make sure the Kugan law is being followed. Don't end up like me. The Kugan Act, California Civil Code, Section 36.1 became his true legacy. It was more enduring than The Kid and more significant than Uncle Fester. Every time a young actor like Jodie Foster or Ron Howard signed a contract, a judge had to review it. 15% of their earnings were locked away in a trust that no parent could touch. It was a bureaucratic wall built from the rubble of Jackie's life. He took a grim satisfaction in this. He knew that somewhere in Hollywood a child was sleeping soundly because his own nightmares had forced the state to wake up. However, the law could not fix the past. Lillian Coogan died in 1975. She took the secrets of the stolen millions to her grave. There was no deathbed confession, no return of the hidden assets. She died believing she was entitled to every cent she had spent. Jackie attended the services, a dutiful son to the end, but the closure was hollow. The money was gone. The justice was theoretical. He was a 63-year-old man who had generated an empire and inherited dust. His health began to decline in the early 1980s. The years of heavy smoking, the stress of the lawsuits, and the weight of his history took their toll. He suffered from heart trouble and kidney issues. He looked older than his years. The baby face that had once been insured for millions was now lined with the deep grooves of a hard life. On March 1st, 1984, the heart of the first child star finally stopped. Jackie Coogan died of cardiac arrest at Santa Monica Medical Center. He was 69 years old. The news of his death rippled through the industry, but it did not stop the world, as The Kid had done in 1921. It was a quiet passing. The obituaries mentioned Charlie Chaplin. They mentioned the Addams Family. They mentioned the lawsuit, but few captured the sheer scale of the theft. At the time of his death, Jackie Coogan's estate was valued at a fraction of what he had earned in a single month during his prime. He left behind a few $1,000s and a modest pension. The $60 million that he had generated as a boy had been completely metabolized by the greed of his parents. It existed only in the form of old fur coats rotting in storage and the faded memories of parties thrown 50 years prior. His funeral was not a state affair. There were no throngs of weeping fans blocking the streets. It was attended by family, friends, and a handful of old Hollywood veterans who remembered when he was the king. John Astin, who played Gomez Addams, was there. They buried him at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City. But the true funeral for Jackie Coogan had happened decades earlier, in a courtroom in 1938. That was when the boy died and the survivor was born. Today, the Coogan law stands as the only monument to his suffering. It is a living, breathing mechanism that protects thousands of children every year. When Macaulay Culkin's parents tried to seize his fortune in the 1990s, the courts blocked them because of Jackie Coogan. When Britney Spears' finances were scrutinized, the legal framework used was built on the foundation of Kugan versus Kugan. He is the patron saint of the exploited. He is the sacrificial lamb of the entertainment industry. He proved that fame is a parasite that will eat its host if left unchecked. The final image of Jackie Coogan is a split screen of American horror. On one side is the beautiful weeping child in the oversized cap, begging for love. On the other side is the bald, cackling monster, lighting a bulb in his mouth to make the audience laugh. They are the same person. The monster is just the child who survived the theft of his soul. Jackie Coogan lost everything so that no child would ever have to lose everything again. It was a terrible price to pay, but he paid it in full. And in the cold, transactional history of Hollywood, that is the only victory that matters.